They handed my twin brother the keys to our family's future right in front of me. They thought I'd just take it. They were wrong. Now they're begging for forgiveness they'll never get. It's funny how a single word can become a splinter in your mind, burrowing deeper over the years until it feels like a part of your own bone structure. For me, that word was hobby. It was delivered on the evening of my 18th birthday, which I shared, of course, with my twin brother, Ethan. Our mother, Carol, had arranged a dinner at a stuffy restaurant that my father, Richard, liked. The kind of place with white tablecloths so stiff they could stand up on their own, and waiters who moved with the silent, unsettling grace of ghosts. Ethan was in his element. He'd just been accepted into a prestigious summer internship at a finance firm in the city, and he wore the news like a tailored suit. He spoke about derivatives and market projections, words that sounded important even if no one at the table, save for maybe my father, truly understood them. My dad was practically glowing. He leaned forward, his own reflection gleaming in the polished surface of the table, soaking in every word. Richard had tried his hand at business in his younger days, a series of failed ventures that left him with a lingering bitterness and a desperate need to see his ambitions realized in his son. In Ethan, he didn't just see his son, he saw a second chance. "That's my boy," he said, raising his wine glass. His voice was thick with a pride he never showed me. "Ethan's going to do the things I never could. He's going to build something real." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the sensation of the air being slowly squeezed from the room. I had news of my own. After years of working after school and on weekends, saving up for tools and honing my skills, I had been accepted into a highly competitive apprenticeship program with a master cabinet maker, one of the best on the East Coast. It was my dream. It was the first step toward building something with my own hands. When there was a lull in the conversation, I cleared my throat. "I have some news, too," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room. "I got into the Northwood Artisans program." My mother smiled her gentle, non-committal smile. "Oh, Leo, that's wonderful, dear." My father turned to me, his focus shifting for the first time that evening. He took a sip of his wine, studying me over the rim of the glass. "Northwood, huh? That's the woodworking thing, right?" "It's a master carpentry apprenticeship." I corrected him, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a 3-year program. By the end, I'll be certified to open my own shop." Ethan chuckled from across the table, a slick, easy sound. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. "That's a cute hobby, bro, seriously." The words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. But it was my father's reaction that drove the splinter in. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the table at large, giving my shoulder a perfunctory pat. "That's good, son," he said, his voice already moving on. "A man needs a hobby." And that was it. My future, my passion, the very thing that made me feel alive, was dismissed as a hobby. A little pastime to keep me busy while my brother, the real son, went on to build the family's future. In that moment, I understood with a cold, hard clarity that in my father's blueprint for the family, I was not part of the foundation. I wasn't even on the page. I was a doodle in the margin, an afterthought, a hobby. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I watched their mouths move, heard the sounds of their laughter, but it all felt like it was happening behind a thick pane of glass. I was there, but I wasn't. It was a feeling I had grown up with, but that night, it solidified from a vague discomfort into a hard, painful truth. I didn't just feel like the other son. I was being told that's all I would ever be. A few months later, a letter arrived that would change everything. It was from an attorney's office, addressed to my parents. It concerned the last will and testament of my maternal grandfather, who had passed away the year before. My grandfather was a quiet man, a mechanic by trade, with hands as calloused and capable as my own were becoming. He was the one person in my life who had ever seemed to truly see me. He'd come to my middle school science fairs to see the ridiculous catapults I'd built, and he'd examine the wobbly bookshelves I made in shop class with the serious consideration of a master inspector. He'd nod and say, "Good joints, Leo. Solid." That was high praise coming from him. My parents, Ethan, and I gathered in the living room. My father read the letter aloud. Most of the estate, the house and savings, had been settled already, going to my grandmother. But there was a specific provision my grandfather had set up years ago, a trust fund. A trust fund established for the future of my two grandsons, Leo and Ethan. My father read, his voice taking on a new, more serious tone. The amount was $200,000. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a life-changing sum of money. For Ethan, it was a shortcut to the high-stakes world he so desperately wanted to conquer. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the key. It was the down payment on a workshop, the funding for top-of-the-line equipment, the capital to turn my hobby into a life. It was the tangible proof of my grandfather's faith in me. But then my father read the final, crucial line of the clause. And I assigned my son, Richard, as the trustee, with full authority to manage these funds for their best interest. I saw a flicker of something in my father's eyes. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a royal flush. My mother, ever the peacemaker, clasped her hands together. "Oh, Richard, Frank always thought so highly of you. He trusted you to do the right thing for the boys." "Of course," my father said, folding the letter with a sharp crease. "And I will." I held on to the word there. Their best interest. It meant both of us. Bill said so. My grandfather had said so. For the first time in a long time, a fragile tendril of hope began to curl in my chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment the scales would finally be balanced. An inheritance wasn't my father's approval, but it was my grandfather's, and it was a form of validation so concrete it couldn't be ignored. The money was a tool, and I knew exactly how to use it to build a future. My father decided that the family should make a formal announcement about how the funds would be used. "We'll discuss our plans at Thanksgiving dinner," he declared, in front of the whole family. "We'll honor Frank's legacy properly." The idea filled me with a sense of dread, but also that flickering hope. A public announcement meant transparency. It meant he couldn't just brush me aside. In front of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, he would have to acknowledge that the fund was for both of his sons. For the next few weeks, I allowed myself to dream. I sketched out workshop layouts in a notebook. I browsed websites for used table saws and industrial-grade planers. I felt the weight of my future for the first time, feeling not like a burden, but like a beautiful piece of raw timber, waiting for my hands to shape it. I was a fool. Thanksgiving at our house was always a performance. It was a carefully staged production of the perfect, prosperous family, with my mother directing the flow of food and my father directing the conversation. That year, the air was thicker than usual, charged with an unspoken anticipation. My Aunt Clara was there, my mother's sister, a kind but timid woman who always seemed to watch our family dynamics with a pained look in her eyes. My uncles were there, talking about sports and politics, and my cousins were scattered around, absorbed in their phones. We went through the motions, the dry turkey, the lumpy mashed potatoes, the forced compliments to the chef. All the while, I felt my father's gaze on me from time to time, cool and appraising. I kept my head down, focusing on my plate, waiting for the main event. Finally, after the pumpkin pie was served, my father tapped his glass with a fork. The chatter died down. This was it. "As you all know," he began, standing at the head of the table like a king addressing his court. "My father-in-law, Frank, was a wonderful, generous man. He left a significant trust for my two boys to help them build their futures." He paused for effect, letting the weight of the statement settle. I could feel my Aunt Clara's eyes on me from across the table. I risked a glance at her, and she gave me a small, encouraging smile. "Carol and I have had many long discussions about this," my father continued. "We've thought about what it means to act in the best interest of our sons, and how to best honor Frank's legacy. He was a man who believed in building things that last." My heart hammered against my ribs. Building things that last. That's what I did. That was my entire world. "And that's why," my father said, his chest puffing out, "we have made a decision to ensure this legacy is not just maintained, but grown, to ensure it provides a foundation for generations to come. We have decided to entrust the full management and use of the $200,000 fund to Ethan." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so complete, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was a silence of shock, of disbelief. My disbelief. Ethan sat there, tried to look humble, but a smug, triumphant light danced in his eyes. My mother stared at her plate, her knuckles white where she gripped her fork. I found my voice. It came out as a croak. What? The will said it was for both of us. My father turned his gaze on me. It was cold, devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. It was the look of a CEO addressing a subordinate. The will gives me the authority to manage the funds as I see fit. And I see fit to invest it, not spend it. Leo, he said, my name sounding like an annoyance on his tongue. Let's be practical. Ethan understands the market. He understands wealth. He will turn that 200,000 into 2 million. He will build this family's future. Then he delivered the final, killing blow. He gestured towards me with a dismissive wave of his hand. What would you do with it? Buy a few new saws? A new drill press? This family needs a future, Leo, not a new coffee table. The laughter from Ethan's side of the table was soft, but it cut me like a razor. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Aunt Clara looked down at her lap, her face pale. No one said a word. No one defended me. In their silence, they were all complicit. They were all signing off on the verdict. I was nothing. My dreams were nothing. My skills were a joke. I was a coffee table. Ethan was the future. Something inside me didn't break. It simply went cold. It was the coldness of a fire that has finally run out of fuel. The hope I had foolishly nurtured withered and died in an instant, turning to ash. I looked at my father, at the man who was supposed to protect me, who was supposed to believe in me, and I saw a stranger. A man so blinded by his own vicarious ambition that he would cannibalize one son's future to feed the others. I slowly, deliberately placed my fork and knife down on my plate. The clink of silver against ceramic was the only sound in the room. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. I stood up. My mother looked up, her eyes pleading. Leo, don't. I looked at her, then at my father, then at Ethan. I didn't say a word. There were no words left to say. They had said them all. I turned my back on the entire table, on the entire performance, and walked out of the dining room. I could feel every eye on my back, but I didn't care. As I walked up the stairs to my room, I wasn't running away. I was walking towards the only door they had left open for me. The exit. I packed in a state of chillingly calm efficiency. I didn't throw things. I didn't cry. The time for hot rage was over. What was left was the cold, hard certainty of a decision made. I pulled out 2 large duffel bags and began to fill them. Not with memories, not with sentimental junk. I packed my work clothes, my boots, my collection of drafting pencils, and the worn books on joinery and wood types that I'd read a dozen times. I carefully wrapped my grandfather's old hand plane in a thick towel and placed it inside. Everything else, the clothes my mother bought me, the gifts from my father, the artifacts of a life that no longer felt like mine, I left behind. As I was zipping the second bag, my door opened. It was my parents. My mother's face was streaked with tears. My father's was a mask of stern confusion. What in God's name do you think you're doing? He demanded. I'm leaving, I said, my voice flat. I slung one bag over my shoulder. Don't be ridiculous, he scoffed. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly. For the first time in my life, I think I am, I replied, looking him straight in the eye. You made your decision. You announced who matters in this family and who doesn't. I heard you. I accept it. Oh, Leo, please, my mother sobbed, reaching for my arm. Don't do this to us. Don't do this to your brother. He needs you. I pulled my arm away, not roughly, but with a finality that made her flinch. No, I said, the word tasting like rust. He doesn't need me. He needs a shadow, and I'm done with the job. My resignation is effective immediately. I pushed past them and walked down the stairs. My father followed, his voice rising. Where will you go? What will you do? You have nothing. I stopped at the front door and turned. I have my hands, and I have my trade. It turns out that's more than I ever had here. And with that, I walked out into the cold November night, closing the door on 18 years of my life. I didn't look back. I drove my beat-up pickup truck across town, the engine rattling in protest. I had no plan, no destination, just a burning need to be anywhere else. On instinct, I drove to the one place that felt like a sanctuary. the Northwood workshop. It was late, but a single light was on inside. Sam, the owner and master craftsman, was there, sweeping sawdust into a neat pile. He was a man in his late 60s, with a face like a road map and hands that looked like they were carved from oak. He looked up as I entered, his eyes taking in the duffel bags and the look on my face. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just nodded toward the back of the cavernous workshop. "There's a small apartment upstairs," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Barely used. The key's on the hook. You can start paying rent when you get your first check from the apprenticeship." He paused, leaning on his broom. "Show up at 7 tomorrow morning. Sharp." I could only manage a choked, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he grunted. "Just do good work." The first few weeks were a blur of exhaustion and focus. I threw myself into the work, learning the language of wood, the precision of the tools. I was a ghost in my new life, silent and driven. One afternoon, Sam gave me a notoriously difficult piece of joinery to complete, a dovetail joint on a tricky piece of tiger maple. I struggled with it for hours, alone in my corner, my frustration mounting. I was terrified of asking for help, terrified of showing weakness. It had been drilled into me that I had to be the strong, self-sufficient one, the one who never needed anything. Sam must have been watching me. He walked over, silent as ever, and stood there for a long minute. Finally, he spoke. "Kid," he said, his voice not unkind, "you're allowed to ask a question. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart." It was such a simple statement, but it hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the exact opposite of every unspoken rule I had lived by. In my father's world, asking for help was an admission of failure. In Sam's world, it was a tool for success. That evening, for the first time since I left, I allowed myself to cry. Tucked away in a dusty corner of the workshop was my other project. It was a wreck, the skeleton of a small, 16-foot wooden skiff left to rot for decades. The ribs were cracked, the transom was crumbling. It was forgotten and discarded. I'd hauled it in one weekend, paying the junkyard $20 for it. I started working on it at night, after my long hours in the shop. I'd traced the elegant, broken lines, imagining what it once was. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to bring it back to life. I replaced a rotted rib here, sanded a patch of peeling varnish there. The boat became my confessor, my therapy. It was a broken thing that I, with my own two hands, could make whole again. It was a mirror. 3 years passed. The boy who had walked out of his family's home on Thanksgiving night was gone. In his place was a 21-year-old man who knew the difference between red oak and white oak by scent alone, whose hands were a permanent latticework of calluses and small, healed-over scars. I had completed my apprenticeship with honors. Sam had taken me on as a junior partner, and our small, two-man shop was gaining a reputation for quality that kept us perpetually busy. I was self-sufficient. I was respected for my skill, but I was an island. The betrayal had left a deep scar, a profound distrust of people and their intentions. I had friends, the kind to grab a beer with after work, but I kept everyone at arm's length. My life was my work, and my work was my life. The only thing I truly opened up to was the old wooden boat, which was now beginning to look less like a wreck and more like a vessel. Then I met Maya. She ran a small coffee shop and art gallery in the storefront next to our workshop. She had paint perpetually smudged on her fingers and a laugh that was loud and uninhibited. She started bringing over coffee for me and Sam in the mornings. "Sawdust and caffeine," she'd say, setting the cups down on a clear patch of workbench. The breakfast of champions. I was polite but distant. I'd thank her, answer her questions with single words, and immediately turn back to my work. I saw the way she looked around the shop, her artist's eye taking in the shapes, the textures, the half-finished projects. I was waiting for the condescension, the dismissive hobby comment. I was waiting for her to reveal that, like everyone else, she didn't get it. But she never did. Instead, she'd ask questions. "How do you get the wood to bend like that without breaking? What's that joint called? It looks like a puzzle." She wasn't just making small talk. She was genuinely curious. One afternoon, she came in and saw me working on the boat. I was carefully fitting a new piece of mahogany for the gunnel. I was so absorbed I didn't hear her approach. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. I stiffened, my defenses immediately going up. She's a wreck. No, Maya insisted, walking closer. She ran a hand gently over the newly sanded hull. A wreck is something you throw away. This is a restoration. It's different. She looked at my hands, at the tools laid out in perfect order beside me. You're not just fixing it. You're healing it. I didn't know what to say. No one had ever described my work that way. No one had ever looked past the sawdust and the noise to see the intention behind it. She pointed to a small, intricate carving I'd been working on near the stern, a stylized compass rose. What does that mean? I hesitated. I hadn't shown it to anyone. It's just a design, I mumbled. I don't believe that, she said, her eyes meeting mine. They were honest and direct. Artists don't do things just because that. I looked from her face to the carving, and for the first time in 3 years, I let the wall down just an inch. It's so I always know which way is home, I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Even if home isn't a place you can go back to. She didn't offer pity. She just nodded, a deep understanding in her eyes. Then you have to build a new one, she said simply. From that day on, something shifted. We started talking more. I'd tell her about the different types of wood, and she'd tell me about the principles of color theory. I found myself looking forward to the smell of her coffee in the morning, to the sound of her uninhibited laugh. Slowly, cautiously, the island I had built around myself began to feel a little less lonely. There was perhaps room for a dock. The past has a funny way of staying quiet for years, and then showing up at your door without knocking. For me, it showed up in the form of my Aunt Clara. She appeared at the workshop one rainy Tuesday afternoon, looking older and more worried than I'd ever seen her. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry to just show up like this, but I didn't know who else to turn to." I put down my chisel and wiped my hands on a rag, motioning for her to sit on a stool. Sam gave me a nod from across the shop, his silent way of saying, "I'll give you some space." "What is it, Aunt Clara?" I asked, a sense of foreboding creeping over me. She took a shaky breath. "It's your parents, Leo. It's Ethan. Everything, it's all falling apart." She then unspooled a story of arrogance and ruin that was as predictable as it was catastrophic. Ethan, flush with the $200,000 and my father's blind adoration, had fancied himself a Wall Street prodigy. He made a few lucky initial investments, which only fueled his ego. He started living a life he couldn't afford, lavish dinners, expensive clothes, a sports car. Then he decided to go for the big score. He sank the entire remainder of the trust fund into a single high-risk tech startup that a buddy told him was a sure thing. The company went bankrupt 6 months later, taking every last cent of my grandfather's legacy with it. But it didn't stop there. That was the part that made my blood run cold. "That wasn't the worst of it," Aunt Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Before the fund was gone, to get more capital for the investment, Ethan convinced your father to take out a second mortgage on a house." I stared at her, speechless. The house, the place I grew up in, the symbol of my family's entire middle-class existence. "Your father co-signed everything," she continued. "Ethan told him it was just paperwork, a formality. Richard, he wanted to believe in Ethan so badly, Leo. He didn't read the fine print. Now the investment is gone, the trust is gone, and the bank is calling. They're going to foreclose. They're going to lose the house. Everything." I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my gut. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't glee. It was a profound, weary sadness. The perfect family, the golden son, the brilliant future. It was all a house of cards, and the slightest breeze had brought it tumbling down. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. Aunt Clara looked at me, her face a mess of guilt and desperation. "Because they're broken, Leo. Your mother cries all day. Your father just sits in his chair, staring at the wall. Ethan, he's like a ghost. They've told no one. They're too proud, too ashamed." She reached out and gripped my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "They've lost everything. You're all they have left." I pulled my arm away gently. "No, I'm not," I said, the old coldness seeping back into my veins. "They made it very clear 3 years ago that they didn't have me at all." She left soon after, leaving the stench of her perfume and her bad news hanging in the sawdust-filled air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the half-finished boat. The sinking ship in the corner of my workshop suddenly felt a little too on the nose. 2 days later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it anyway. Leo. The voice was thin, reedy, almost unrecognizable. It took me a second to place it. It was my father. In the 3 years since I'd walked out, he had not called me once. "What do you want?" I asked. There was no preamble, no warmth. Just the question. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of a shaky breath. "Leo, we need your help." I leaned against my workbench, the cold steel a grounding presence. "Help with what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He stumbled through the story, his voice cracking, stripped of all its former arrogance and authority. He told me about the investment, the mortgage, the foreclosure notice. It was the same story Aunt Clara had told, but hearing it from him in his defeated, desperate tone was surreal. This was the man who had dismissed my life's passion as a hobby, who had told me to be a man and face reality. Now, his reality was a bonfire, and he was calling me to put out the flames. "They're going to take the house, son," he whispered, the word son sounding pathetic and hollow. "Everything we've ever worked for. It's all gone." I stayed silent, letting his words hang in the dead air between us. "Please," he begged, and the sound was so foreign, so utterly alien coming from him, that it made my skin crawl. "Clara said you were doing well, that you have a partnership. You must have savings. Anything you could lend us, just to stop the bank." And there it was, the ask. He wasn't calling to apologize. He wasn't calling to see how I was. He was calling because his ship was sinking and he thought I was a lifeboat. A wave of something dark and bitter washed over me. It was the accumulated rage of 1,000 slights, a million moments of feeling invisible. It was the voice of the 18-year-old boy who had been publicly humiliated at his own dinner table. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You took my inheritance, the money my grandfather left for me, gave it to my brother to set on fire, and now that you're about to lose your house as a result, you're calling me for a bailout." "Leo, it wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," I snapped, the cold control finally breaking. "Why should I help you? Why should I clean up a mess that you and your golden boy made? You told me this family needed a future, not a coffee table. Looks like you're about to lose both." "You're our son," he cried, his voice cracking completely. "You're our only hope." "Funny," I said, the word dripping with ice. "It's funny how I only become your son when you need something. When your chosen one fails." I took a deep breath, the smell of cedar and varnish filling my lungs. "I'll think about it." Then I hung up. I stood there, my hand still on the phone, my heart pounding. I expected to feel triumphant. I expected to feel a surge of vindication. But I didn't. I just felt empty. The victory was as hollow as a rotted-out log. I walked over to the boat, my boat, and ran my hand along its smooth, strong hull. I didn't have an answer for him. But as I looked at the solid, real thing I had built from nothing, I knew one thing for sure. I would not be playing by his rules anymore. I spent the next 2 days in a fog. I went through the motions at the shop, but my mind was elsewhere. I talked it over with Maya, who just listened, letting me untangle the knots in my own head. I talked it over with Sam, who was more direct. "You don't owe them a damn thing, kid," he said, not looking up from the lathe he was working on. "But you owe it to yourself to face them. Not as their broken kid, but as the man you are now. Go there, look them in the eye, and decide what you want. Not what they want." He was right. I wasn't going back there for them. I was going back for me. I called my father and told him I would come over to discuss options. The relief in his voice was nauseating. When I walked through the front door of that house, it was like stepping into a tomb. The air was heavy and stale. My mother looked like a ghost, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. Ethan was slumped on the couch, staring into space, the slick confidence completely gone, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. And my father, my once booming, arrogant father, looked small, defeated. They had set the dining room table, a pathetic echo of that last Thanksgiving dinner. I ignored it. "Let's stay in here," I said, gesturing to the living room. I wasn't going to sit at that table again. I was setting the terms now. I remained standing while they all sat. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I'm not here to give you money, I began, my voice clear and steady. The flicker of hope in their eyes died. I'm not bailing you out, but I'm willing to offer a business proposition. Before I could continue, Ethan finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was all my fault. I lost everything. Then the dam broke. He started sobbing, great, gulping, undignified sobs. I never knew what I was doing, he choked out. Dad just kept telling me how smart I was, how I was going to be a millionaire. I just wanted him to be proud of me. I always knew you were the one with the real talent, Leo. You could actually make things. I can't do anything. I'm nothing. My father moved to comfort him, but I held up a hand. Let him finish. Richard then turned to me, his face crumpled with a shame so profound it was almost painful to watch. He's right, Leo. This is my fault. I pushed him. I wanted him to be the success I never was. I was a failure in business, and I couldn't stand it. So I put it all on him. He finally looked me in the eye. And I put you aside because you reminded me of what I wasn't. You were practical. You were skilled. You didn't need the empty talk. I was jealous of you, and I resented you for it. I was a terrible father. The confession hung in the air. The truth in all its ugly, pathetic glory. For a moment, the 18-year-old boy inside me wanted to weep with relief, to finally hear the words. But the man I was now, the man who had spent 3 years building himself back from the wreckage they had left, felt something else. A cold clarity. It's not about being a terrible father, I said, my voice measured. It's not about a mistake. You all made a choice. You chose to sacrifice my future to make yourselves feel better. A mistake is accidental. A choice is deliberate, and you have to live with the consequences of your choices. I took a deep breath. It was time to lay out my blueprint. Here is my proposition, I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was a rough plan Sam had helped me structure. The house, as it is, will sell for just enough to cover the debt, if you're lucky. But it's outdated. It needs work. I will personally oversee and perform the necessary renovations to increase its market value. I will put in my labor, my time, and use my connections to get materials at cost. I'll let that sink in. I will create a formal contract. Once the house is sold, after the bank and all material costs are paid back, the remaining profit will be split. 50% will go to you to start over. The other 50% will come to me as payment for my labor, my management, and my share of the inheritance you gambled away. They stared at me, stunned. This wasn't the emotional son coming home to save his family. This was a contractor laying out the terms of a job. I will not save you, I said, my voice hard as ironwood. But I will offer you a business solution. Those are my terms. Accept them or don't. It's your choice. They accepted. They had no other choice. For the next 3 months, my childhood home became my job site. I was there every day at 7 a.m., just like at the shop. I tore out the old kitchen, refinished the hardwood floors that had been hidden under stained carpet, and rebuilt the rotting back deck. My parents and Ethan became ghosts in their own home, tiptoeing around my work, watching in silence as I single-handedly deconstructed and rebuilt their world. There were no warm family moments. There was no reconciliation over coffee. It was a business arrangement, and I kept it that way. The only person I spoke to with any regularity was my father, and our conversations were strictly about the project, lumber costs, timelines, scheduling the plumber. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was the client, and I was the professional in charge. In a strange way, it was the most honest and respectful relationship we'd ever had. When the work was done, the house sold in less than a week for a price that shocked them all. It was more than enough to pay off the bank and all the debts. As per our contract, I transferred half of the remaining profit to their account. It was a substantial sum, enough for a small apartment and a fresh start. The other half I invested directly into my own business, officially buying into the partnership with Sam. We renamed the shop Sam and Leo's Fine Woodworking. My relationship with my family now exists in the form of polite, infrequent phone calls. My parents moved to a smaller town a few hours away. My father got a job at a hardware store. Ethan, humbled and broken, is working a simple office job, slowly paying back the personal debts he owes. They are rebuilding just as I did, but we are not rebuilding together. The chasm between us is too wide. The foundation's too rotten to ever support the weight of what was broken. I don't hate them anymore. Hate is a fire that requires fuel, and I simply have nothing left to give it. I feel a distant, quiet pity. Today, the sun is bright on the water. The air smells of salt and fresh varnish. Maya is sitting at the bow, her hair blowing in the wind, her laughter mixing with the sound of the gulls. I'm at the tiller of a 16-foot wooden skiff, its mahogany hull gleaming, cutting cleanly through the waves. It took me a year after selling the house to finally finish it. It is, without a doubt, the finest thing I have ever built. After we launched it for the first time, Maya had presented me with a small, beautifully lettered brass plate. I'd affixed it to the dashboard, right above the compass. It has a new name. It's not the other one. It's not a reminder of the hurt. It's a statement of fact. It reads, "The Craftsman." Maya turns and smiles at me. "How are you feeling?" she asks, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the motor. I look at my hands on the tiller, calloused and strong. I look at the endless horizon ahead of us, a future I built from sawdust and splinters. I look at the woman who saw me when I felt invisible. A real, genuine smile spreads across my face. It feels easy. It feels earned. For the first time, I say, in the words of the truest I've ever spoken, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.